Hello everyone and welcome to this new class of this typography course. We are going to continue with this journey through the history of typography. We are now entering the 17th and 18th centuries where a new type of typography will emerge, which over time has been called transitional typefaces. This name comes from the fact that these are typefaces that, as we will see, are situated in the middle in the transition between the Venetian ones we saw in the previous class and a new type of typeface called modern Romanes or Diedones, which we will see in the next class. The fact is that we find ourselves in the 17th and 18th centuries, as we mentioned, a period in history where absolute monarchies predominated in Europe, which gradually became enlightened absolute monarchies. Since in the 18th century, we already know that the Enlightenment begins, and then all these kings will welcome wise men and scholars into their courts. As we can imagine, the printing business, the business of printing books, is one of the most important, and these royal houses, with their all-encompassing power, want to participate in the business. Therefore, we will talk about the French, English, and Spanish royal houses, which were among the most important in the field of typography. Starting with the French royal house, Louis XIV, nicknamed the Great or the Sun King, and the longest reigning king of the French monarchy, will hire Philippe Grandjean. Pardon the French pronunciation. The objective is to design a new typeface for the French royal house. Philippe Grandjean was a punch cutter. We already know that the punch was the element used for engraving the different letters onto the movable type. And Grandjean then will propose a way to design the typeface based on a grid of 2,304 squares. On this grid, he will propose a mathematical process to draw each of the letters based on proportions and geometry, as we saw with Albrecht Dürer, trying in the process to modernize the typefaces, giving them a more sophisticated and refined appearance. Highlight that these grids are very reminiscent of our current bitmaps. In this way, they will be developed. Known as Romana del Rey, it has gone down in history as the first transitional typeface. We have to keep in mind that we are entering the 18th century and that the system of measurements is still very, very rudimentary. In this context, a very important figure emerges, which is Pierre-Simon Fourier. Fourier was a typographer, type founder, and typography theorist, also French. And he has gone down in history because he created a standardized measurement system that revolutionized the typographic industry. Here we see a bit of the greatest contribution of this standardization, which consisted of starting from a letter of the nonpareil typeface, an Italian typeface of the time. By choosing the letter A in its smallest size, Simon Fourier divided its height into 6 parts, and to each of these parts he gave a name. Later, he established that the standard reading size would be 12 points. He called those 12 points Cicero. I'm sure this sounds familiar to you because points are something we use today in the publishing industry, and when we open InDesign, the 12 points are normally the of size that appears to us in the typography. As a note, highlight that 1 point equals 0.35 millimeters, although the decimal system in this case is not too relevant either. Well, and continuing along the 18th century, another figure named William Caslon will appear, who will be responsible for carrying out the new typography that the royal house, in this case English, commissions from him. William Caslon was a type founder and engraver, and his typography has indeed reached our days. Adobe has digitized it under the name Adobe Caslon Pro, so you can download it very easily. Moving on, we have to talk about John Baskerville. John Baskerville, unlike Caslon, was an independent businessman. He founded his own printing press, which allowed him much more freedom to experiment with type design. As I mark here, it seems that his work was quite belittled back then. It was said that his typography was made for the blind because it could not be read. But the truth is that Baskerville's contributions started the path toward a new evolution in typography. And many of his works have been redesigned by foundries like Linotype or Monotype. The version of his typography can also be found today. There are different versions, but it is always found under the name Baskerville. Jumping now to the Spanish royal house, we can highlight the typeface called Pradel, designed by Udal Pradel, also commissioned by the Spanish royal house, or the Ibarra, created by Jerónimo Gil and used by the printer Joaquín Ibarra for an edition of Don Quixote from 1780. Both typefaces have been digitized today, and we can also easily find them by Googling on the internet. Well, we already have a general idea of what transitional typefaces are, but let's solidify this knowledge. We can say that transitional typefaces originated in the 17th century and developed in the 18th century and are an evolution of the old Roman typeface, which we saw in the previous class. They are characterized by being in the transition between the old and the modern. And what are their main characteristics? We can highlight that the axis of the letters is more vertical, and there is a greater contrast between thick and thin strokes, that the serifs are more straight and defined, and that the shapes are more rationalized and geometric. We are going to see all this right now, graphically. In summary, the Venetian ones have a more organic and calligraphic design, and by organic, we can understand irregular, while the transitional ones begin to show greater precision and contrast, approaching the style of modern typefaces. And here we see the comparison. On top, we have the Adobe Jensen Pro typeface, a characteristic typeface of what we have called Venetian, Roman, or Aldine typefaces. And below, we have the same word written with the Baskerville typeface. So, take a look. The characteristics we were mentioning were, first, that the axis of the letters in the new transitional typefaces is straighter, not inclined. This could be seen in letters like the O or the G. In the Jensen, we see how the axis is inclined, whereas in the Baskerville, it is completely at 90 degrees. We also mentioned that there is a greater contrast between thin and thick lines, and we can observe this as well. We see how in the Jensen, the thinnest part of the stroke of each letter compared to the thickest part, that contrast is less in the Jensen than in the Baskerville. That is to say, the Baskerville accentuates the contrast. We also talked about how transitional typefaces use more straight and defined serifs. We can clearly see in the image how the serifs of the Jensen still have that fully calligraphic trace, as if it had been written by hand, that irregularity of humanism. Whereas Baskerville is much more geometric, a human hand, it can hardly reach that level of precision without using a ruler or similar tools. And finally, we were talking about how transitional typefaces use more rational and geometric shapes, and we can see it by comparing one letter with another. We come therefore from the Venetian typefaces. We are currently in the transitional typefaces, and we are heading towards the modern Roman typefaces, also called Didones. We will see these in the next class. To conclude, I leave you here this slide where you can see the 4 typefaces we have covered in this class: Adobe Caslon Pro, Baskerville, Pradel, and Ibarra. Each of them has its own nuances. I have to say, for example, that these types of fonts help me a lot when designing covers for books related to history set in this era. At the publishing house where I work, many books about the Spanish Empire are made. So, for example, the Ibarra or Pradel typefaces are very useful to me. Here I show you 2 examples. On the left, I use the Ibarra Real Nova typeface in its uppercase version, and on the right, I used another typeface, which I haven't mentioned, because there are many of this style, called Rufina, and it's the one currently used by the Royal House of England. You can see the title in uppercase and the subtitle in lowercase. Alright, with this I say goodbye. I should mention that at the end of this typography module, there will be an exercise where you will have to choose the fonts to use for different covers. I will give you all the information, the entire cover already designed, and all that will be left is for you to choose the fonts in another case. It's going to be a very fun exercise, I think, to put into practice everything learned.